And thanks to you at home for staying with us for the next hour. Right now, as we speak, the Florida governor's office looks like this. Somewhere north of 100 protesters have taken over the State House office of Florida Governor Rick Scott. It is peaceful. There have been no arrests. Clearly, there has been singing. But this does not look like it is ending anytime soon. This started early this afternoon when protesters gathered on the steps here of the state capitol building in Florida. And then they decided that they were going to march to the governor's office directly, saying they want to meet with Florida Governor Rick Scott. They will not leave his office, they say, until they do meet with him. That means that at least they are planning on occupying Rick Scott's office overnight tonight. Right now, law enforcement thus far saying that as long as the group does not interfere with state business, the group will not be asked to leave. The director of the Capitol Police saying, quote, "We will close these doors into the governor's suite, and they, the protesters, will be allowed to remain here." Photos of this protest today at the governor's office were posted on social media by some of the protesters themselves, also by reporters from Florida news outlets that cover the state capitol and are not used to covering anything nearly this exciting. But unless something changes overnight, this is the office scene that will greet Governor Rick Scott when he finally gets back to work. Governor Scott is apparently out of town at the moment on a trip to New York. But even while he is away, he has already responded in writing to the group's demands. The protesters say they want Governor Scott to call a special legislative session in Florida to pass what they are calling the Trayvon Martin Civil Rights Act, which would include a repeal of the state's Stand Your Ground law. Rick Scott today, in a written statement, already said no. The governor's communications director emailed to the Today Show this statement, quote, "Immediately following Trayvon Martin's death, Governor Scott called a bipartisan special task force with 19 citizens to review Florida's Stand Your Ground law. The task force recommended that the law should not be overturned, and Governor Scott agrees." Do you remember that task force, actually? The chair who Rick Scott put in charge of that task force was his lieutenant governor. His lieutenant governor, who has since been forced to resign in a corruption scandal over internet gambling and scamming veterans charities. But anyway, that task force, under her leadership, made the decision to leave Stand Your Ground in place in Florida. And Rick Scott says, at least as of this afternoon, he is sticking to that decision. That, however, does not mean that the issue is going away. Yesterday in Gainesville, Florida, another young group of protesters took over the local office of the Department of Justice, making the same demand.
Stand your ground!
Change the law!
Stand your ground!
Change the law!
They marched from Bo Diddley Plaza right into the federal building in Gainesville, and from there they marched up 3 flights of stairs to the U.S. Attorney's office to make their case. Again, no arrests, a peaceful takeover, a peaceful but very vocal, very determined demonstration. Florida Democratic legislators are now echoing the demands of these protesters, saying that Stand Your Ground should be reconsidered in Florida. One legislator, who is an African-American man, is telling the press now that he says even he personally now feels afraid to go running in sweatpants and a hoodie the way he used to because of this case. Again, though, as of late this afternoon, Rick Scott is already saying no to that demand. Him saying no does not necessarily mean the pressure is going to ebb in Florida. And indeed, this afternoon, the pressure stepped up dramatically late in the day when Attorney General Eric Holder gave the keynote speech at the NAACP convention, which is convened this week in Orlando, Florida. And in a surprise move in his speech today, the Attorney General springboarded beyond the specifics of this case and the tragedy of Trayvon Martin's death to make a blunt, broadside attack on Florida, on the laws of the state of Florida, specifically on the Stand Your Ground law, the law that says, essentially, if you feel afraid, you can kill the person who made you feel that way. I should note, though, beyond his very pointed attack on that policy issue, though, the Attorney General also spoke in terms that were very personal, and for him especially, I think, pretty emotional.
Years ago, some of these same issues drove my father to sit down with me, to have a conversation, which is no doubt familiar to many of you, about how, as a young black man, I should interact with the police, what to say, and how to conduct myself if I was ever stopped or confronted in a way that I thought was unwarranted. Now, I'm sure my father felt certain at that time that my parents' generation would be the last that had to worry about such things for their children. The news of Trayvon Martin's death last year and the discussions that have taken place since then reminded me of my father's words so many years ago. And they brought me back to a number of experiences that I had as a young man, when I was pulled over twice and my car searched on the New Jersey Turnpike when I'm sure I wasn't speeding, or when I was stopped by a police officer while simply running to catch a movie at night in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. I was, at the time of that last incident, a federal prosecutor. So, Trayvon's death last spring caused me to sit down to have a conversation with my own 15-year-old son, like my dad did with me. This was a father-son tradition I hoped would not need to be handed down. But as a father who loves his son and who is more knowing in the ways of the world, I had to do this to protect my boy.
Attorney General Eric Holder speaking today at the NAACP convention in Orlando, Florida. What happens next here? The governor's office in Florida is right this second and looks to be overnight occupied with a sit-in. It's happening now. It's expected to last overnight and into tomorrow. Protesters demanding to see the governor, saying they will not leave the office until they do get to see the governor, saying that what they want is for Florida's stand your ground law to be taken off the books. This weekend, there will be more pressure, and it will be nationwide pressure. Civil rights activists, including the National Action Network's and MSNBC's own Reverend Al Sharpton, announcing today that they expect vigils in more than 100 cities this weekend, including at federal buildings. Vigils demanding that Eric Holder's Justice Department bring federal charges in this case now that there has been an acquittal at the state level. If there were federal charges, those would likely be hate crimes charges, although it was very hard to figure out how likely it might be that the Justice Department could try to bring that prosecution. Meanwhile, though, the Attorney General today, bluntly and without euphemism, going right after the state of Florida, saying its laws contribute to more violence than they prevent. Listen to how the Attorney General made his case. Listen to this.
It's time to question laws that senselessly expand the concept of self-defense and sow dangerous conflict in our neighborhoods. These laws try to fix something that was never broken. There has always been a legal defense for using deadly force if, and the if is important, if no safe retreat is available. But we must examine laws that take this further by eliminating the common sense and age-old requirement that people who feel threatened have a duty to retreat outside their home. They can do so safely. By allowing and perhaps encouraging violent situations to escalate in public, such laws undermine public safety. The list of resulting tragedies is long and unfortunately has victimized too many who are innocent. It is our collective obligation. We must stand our ground to ensure that our laws reduce violence and take a hard look at laws that contribute to more violence than they prevent.
Joining us now is Sam Bagenstos. He served in the Justice Department as the #2 official in the Civil Rights Division from 2009 to 2011. He's currently a law professor at the University of Michigan. Mr. Bagenstos, thank you very much for your time tonight. I appreciate having you here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So the Attorney General came out very strongly today against the stand your ground law that exists in Florida, and it exists in other states as well. In concrete terms, does the Justice Department have any role to play in terms of seeking changes to laws like that?
Well, I think the role that the Justice Department has is really the role that the Attorney General engaged in today, which is to use the bully pulpit to try to continue the conversation that really began with the Trayvon Martin shooting about whether these laws are a good idea.
As a civil rights lawyer, as somebody who practiced at very high levels in this field, can you explain to me how stand your ground laws legally mesh with civil rights concerns? I mean, with law enforcement, we can track who gets arrested, who gets convicted, how severe the sentences are. We can track all that for signs that the justice system is somehow skewed. Is there a civil rights question about the way stand your ground is applied?
Well, I think there's definitely a civil rights question about how it's applied. There's some very instructive but early, nonetheless instructive work from the Urban Institute about the racial effects of stand your ground laws, and particularly the way that disproportionately it seems like, based on what we know, in white on black crime, you have a higher number of people being exonerated, essentially, because of stand your ground laws. So that's very concerning from a civil rights perspective.
What about the Attorney General's argument today that these were laws that were designed to solve a problem that didn't exist, that there was nothing wrong with the age-old consideration of self-defense as a defense to having killed somebody or hurt somebody? Do you agree with him, and what do you think he meant by that assertion?
Well, so it's always been the case that self-defense, even before a stand your ground law existed, that a person can defend him or herself if there is a threat to life or serious bodily injury and there's no reasonable opportunity to retreat with safety. What the stand your ground law does is says a person doesn't have to retreat, doesn't have to break off from a fight like that, even if there's an opportunity to do so safely. So it increases the chances that someone will use deadly force when it's not really necessary to do that.
One of the unknowns beyond whether or not Florida might change its stand your ground law, other states might, in response to the kind of pressure we saw from the Attorney General and from these protesters today, pressure I think that's going to be ongoing. One of the other things we're waiting to find out is whether the Justice Department might get involved to prosecute George Zimmerman under federal charges. Likely that would be federal hate crimes law. How difficult do you think it would be to make that case? Much of the commentary around that makes it sound like it would be almost impossible.
Well, I think it would be very difficult. So in order to prove a hate crime, the Justice Department would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that George Zimmerman acted because of Trayvon Martin's race. And the problem with proving that beyond a reasonable doubt in a case like this is there were only two people who were there close enough to really hear what went on. One is dead and the other person doesn't have to testify. So proving what was on his mind is going to be very difficult.
From your experience at the Justice Department, should people understand the hate crimes law as being of being more symbolic value or political value than prosecutorial value? I mean, our case is brought under those statutes.
A lot of cases are brought. It's actually a very significant and important statute. In the years from 2009 to 2012, the Justice Department got convictions of 141 defendants in hate crimes cases, and these are hate crimes involving people targeted because of race, as well as people targeted because of religion, sexual orientation, etc. It's a very significant and important problem.
Sam Bagenstos, former principal deputy assistant attorney general for civil rights at the Justice Department, now at University of Michigan Law. Thank you very much for your time tonight, Professor. It's nice to have you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. At around 5 o'clock today, 5 o'clock Eastern time, the news gods looked down on us, felt a twinge of pity, and said, "Here, this is for you." That gift is next.